Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, an accidental villain tells the tale of Major General Sir Hugh Tudor. Linden MacIntyre has explored this man's history and brings it to us now. Welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be here.
So I gather, is this a name that was known in Newfoundland?
Generally, not lately. For a long time, he was considered the mystery man. They knew vaguely who he was because in the First World War, he was a divisional commander. And in his division, he had a battalion of Newfoundlanders from the Newfoundland Regiment. And they performed very well. One of them, a kid, a 17-year-old fellow soldier, won the Victoria Cross in the final months of the war under Tudor's command. So he was known. His arrival in Newfoundland was generally publicized because he was considered to be an interesting guy and that he was going into the fishery, which was very interesting because he knew nothing about fish or anything else in business. So he was around. He kept a very low profile. He was constantly aware that a lot of Irish nationalists and Republicans would kill him if they got the chance. He usually went around armed with a .455 Webley revolver in one pocket, a little gun that you could hold in your fist, and it was almost invisible, strange little weapon, in another pocket, and brass knuckles. So he was prepared for any eventuality around St. John's, Newfoundland, but he never did have a problem, although there was a rumor, which we could, if you're interested, there was and continues to be a myth that the IRA actually sent 2 assassins over to kill him, and they failed. So, he was generally known, but in more recent decades, he had faded from any sort of public profile whatsoever. I bumped into him in an academic paper, and I was quite intrigued by what I saw there and went looking for him.
So what was it about his story that intrigued you? Like what did you bump on and decide to kind of plumb the depths of?
The first thing I noticed and was intrigued by was his intense friendship with Winston Churchill. Churchill was in Newfoundland in 1941 for meetings with the President of the United States on the future of the Second World War and the future of the world afterwards. And the war wasn't going very well for the Allies at the time. So in the middle of all this, Churchill sent an invitation to St. John's to bring General Tudor over to this conference so that they could have lunch and catch up. So I said, what kind of how intense is that friendship? In the middle of the huge crisis in the security of the world, Tudor wants to have tea with his old buddy, who was this guy. And so I checked around and I discovered that their relationship went back into the 1890s when they were young military army officers in India. And that it continued through the Boer War, the First World War, and that they were extremely close. And I went, well, what was the basis of that? As far as I could ascertain, Tudor had no political activity. As a matter of fact, everything I've learned, he was contemptuous of politics. So what was this all about? And so to find out what it was all about, I went back. The most prolific source was First World War. And then I started to dig, if I may just move forward with this a little bit. At the end of the First World War, Tudor went back to civilian life, or went back to a quiet life. He had a family, 4 children, all quite young. And he was sort of contemplating what he was going to do with the rest of his military career when Churchill asked him to take an assignment in Ireland, where there was a very violent uprising of Republicans who wanted to take Ireland out of the empire and free it from the crown. And that would, Churchill at the time saw this as being the beginning of a major catastrophe for the British Empire, and it had to be suppressed. So he persuaded Tudor to go in and do that job by running a police force that would have the task of bringing this under control. And because they were good friends, because Tudor believed he owed Churchill, he accepted the assignment.
So Churchill's friendship with Tudor not only sparked your interest, but also, served as the linchpin for Tudor's history after World War One. That neither this book nor what happened to him would have come about if not for the Churchill factor.
I first of all, if it wasn't for the connection with Churchill, he wouldn't have ever got involved in the Irish War of Independence. If he had never got involved in the Irish War of Independence, he would never have become a fugitive. So it all hinges on his relationship with Churchill, and it gets us into the peculiarity of the Churchill personality, the intense loyalty that Churchill's friends had for him, and it also it reveals a lot about the personality and the character of General Tudor, that he would have such an incredible loyalty to Churchill. I mean, they were friends. We've all got friends going back into our early lives, in our 20s when we were starting things out, and usually those friendships they thin out over time. But this one remained intense for as long as both of these men were alive. They were still writing to each other late in life, and they died just months apart in 1965. So there was some intense quality to this friendship that I figured eventually it was a kind of a mutual admiration thing. Churchill came from a long, prestigious military history and started out as a soldier. He loved war. He told his wife once, "A war is a game played with a smile," and he was constantly, even when he was in the army, when he wasn't directly involved in some conflict, he would get a leave of absence from the army. He would go to where the conflict was with credentials as a journalist, and he would write about it. He just couldn't get enough shooting. And Tudor, on the other hand, came from a very modest family background, and I guess he was obviously quite impressed by his famous friend from the famous family, and the evidence early on in Churchill's life that he was going to go far in politics and history. So one guy was admired because he was a soldier. The other guy was admired because he was a historical character that was going to be an interesting person to know. And Tudor actually did have a position of influence in Churchill's life.
He has that position in life, but in terms of, as you point out in the author's note at the end, like he himself did not expect to be a historically significant person of interest. And so you say, there were maybe deliberately few clues about, his personality, his emotions, how he saw his life. I'm wondering, when you are presented with a person like this, are you drawing on like your journalistic background to like research and figure out who this person is with what few clues there are?
He had a very interesting life before he went to Newfoundland. His involvement in the Irish War of Independence, in my opinion, was a preview of what a lot of wars were going to be like in the 20th century. The wars would involve, on one side, people who were desperate to get out from under the control of other countries and empires and the like. And this was a phenomenon after the First World War, when several of the big empires just fell apart. So you had this sudden scramble for independence and self-determination by people who really didn't have much to work with except their guns and their discipline. So, and then on the other side, you had an empire like the British Empire that was quite determined to hang on to its status as a world power for as long as possible. And the British Empire could see in Ireland the beginning of the end, because there were movements in other parts of the British Empire, in Africa and in India, for independence from Britain and independence from the British Crown. And of course, Britain had a lot of prestige and a lot of economics tied up in these relationships. So they saw in Ireland, these people pulled this off. These Irish people managed to separate from the empire, from the United Kingdom, and break free of the crown. Then they're going to set off a sort of a stampede of people looking for freedom. So it has to be crushed. Now, the challenge that the British faced was that just to send the army in to crush it, as would be the case in many situations, they would invite some fairly unwelcome attention from the United States. The United States had a very large Irish diaspora, all with much of which had a lot of political clout and a lot of ability to cause trouble for Britain in the United States. Churchill at one point was actually worried that this Irish rebellion could set up an international conflict between Britain and the United States. So it was very significant. There was a lot at stake in this struggle that Churchill was facing as Minister for War, and that he wanted Tudor to bring under control. So Tudor goes in, he takes a half a dozen of his wartime comrades from the Western Front. There's the Irish police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, was being reinvented as a paramilitary outfit, and that it had recruited thousands and thousands of English and Scottish army veterans from the First World War, most of whom were very hostile to the Irish people. So this was a fairly lethal military or paramilitary organization that Churchill and Tudor set up in Ireland. And of course, the first thing that Tudor, as a conventional traditional military guy, discovered was that the enemy in an uprising of this nature is very difficult to identify, because they don't wear uniforms. They only fight when it's to their advantage, which means they're in an ambush position or at night. They rely a lot on assassination. They will play any dirty trick whatsoever to get the upper hand. So what he learned and decided really early on was, if we're going to beat these guys, that's how we're going to have to play it too. We'll have to employ assassination, ambush, communal punishment, every dirty trick that we can borrow from them. And that's what he did.
And as you point out, these kind of emerging guerrilla tactics are something that, even Ho Chi Minh, looks upon favorably and determines to, like you said, introduce to the 20th century. I'm curious, in a book like this, had you studied the Irish fight for independence at all before that, or did this investigation of Tudor bring you into the historical research of this area? How much overlap or familiarity did you bring to the table?
I brought a lot of the wrong kind. There's the whole Irish independence struggle goes back over the centuries. It's subject of a lot of mythology and legend and romantic songs and stories. And my mother's side were of Irish extraction. They were sort of fugitives from Ireland from back in the early part of the 1800s. They had that Paddy's Day kind of Irish sentimentality about them, and it sort of made it. I never entirely embraced it, but it made me interested and curious about events in Irish history. So I had a fairly solid, I knew, I'd known about the Black and Tans, for example, this notorious British police outfit that Tudor had to deal with, or that Tudor managed. And so I knew about them. I knew I'd heard a lot of the battles. I mean, there were a number of unsuccessful Irish uprisings over time. I was fairly familiar with the Easter Rising of 1916 because that was a pivotal event in British and Irish relationships. Britain was up against the wall in the First World War, and in the middle of it, the Irish launched an attack to take over the city of Dublin and the government of the British government in Ireland at the time, and it was considered to be a pretty crazy idea. And in fact, a lot of the Irish public were against it. They saw it as treachery. But then the British over-responded by dragging out everybody that they found who had a leadership position in that uprising and putting them in front of a firing squad. So it was all extremely ugly and extremely brutal, and it really did move public opinion into a supportive position as far as Irish independence was concerned. And from that time forward, the handful of radicals and socialists and nationalists, poets, and artists that represented the backbone of the Irish movement, the Irish independence movement, suddenly they had a lot of cachet and support, and it just grew and grew until by 1920, the British government was absolutely losing control of it. And Churchill knew that he had to do something drastic to bring it back under control, and ideally to persuade these Irishmen that they couldn't win it, they wouldn't lose it, but they couldn't win it. So they better sit down and start talking about some sort of a peace treaty, maybe some kind of a basis for an independent Ireland that was still tied in with the British Crown. So that was Tudor's job, and he didn't really understand this. Tudor's job was to pound these people into the dirt until they were forced into a negotiating room and forced to sit down with these British diplomats and politicians, all of whom were world-class negotiators. So you had a bunch of guys who were in the ditches with guns one day, and they're in a boardroom the next day, talking peace and politics and the future, with a bunch of British diplomats who knew all the tricks. And so that's Tudor's contribution, was to force the Irish into that negotiating position, where the diplomats and the politicians then took over, and, to be perfectly blunt, screwed the Irish to the point where the Irish just started fighting among themselves and ended up in a civil war that was even bloodier than the war against the British.
Tudor finds himself in this position because of his friendship with Churchill. You ended up making friends with a couple of people in researching Tudor's life. I'm wondering if you can tell me about John Davenport and Carla Emerson Furlong.
I'm glad you asked that. John, I didn't even know that there were any survivors of the Tudor family, because he abandoned his children early on. I didn't even know that any of them. I knew that some of them had been married, but didn't know any of them had children of their own. I was actually doing a lot of research in old newspapers in St. John's, and I came across a gossip column in which, Tudor did not go out of his way to get publicity or attention. As a matter of fact, he went the opposite direction. But he had a little bit of personal news in the early 50s that was too delicious to keep to himself. So he happened in a conversation with a reporter to mention that his grandson had been accepted on the Oxford University rowing team, which was a major achievement, and would row in the annual regatta against Cambridge University. That was a big deal for an Englishman. It got in the paper. It's a tiny reference in a gossip column, but it gave the name David Davenport, a grandson. So I figured, well, what the heck? I plugged it into Wikipedia. David Davenport pops up as one of the top bridge players in England, and renowned for that. And I made a few more inquiries. Yeah, that's the David Davenport. Sadly, he died before I got to him. But there was a tribute published to David Davenport, what a fabulous person he was. And I got a hold of the person who wrote the tribute. And I mean, in journalism, you just sort of, it's the greatest reward when you reach out into a place where you never know what you're going to touch, and somebody comes back and says, "Oh yes, unfortunately he's dead, but you should talk to his widow. I'll put you in touch." So this person did, and she says, "Oh, David, even if he was alive, he didn't know much about his family. He wasn't very interested. But his brother John would be a good person to talk to." So, so I pulled pushed a few more buttons, and the first thing you know, I'm in touch with John. And he's just a delightful fellow. He's in his 90s, who was always curious about his grandfather. John's mother was Tudor's eldest child and a daughter, and she had gathered up a few bits and pieces of stuff about his life. She'd actually started at one point to write her own little memoir that would include stuff about her dad. She never went very far with it, but she got enough to really give me some stuff. So I started corresponding with him online, and then I went over and I visited him a few times. We became very friendly to each other. He became totally intrigued with what I was doing. I gathered from him earlier, like I'm doing a potential hatchet job on his granddad. But it became obvious after a little while that it didn't matter. He was a very open-minded man. And in fact, just within the last 10 months or so, I sent him a manuscript that is basically what you have in the book. And I wonder, okay, he'll go crazy, he'll drop dead, he'll never speak to me again. But anyway, he wrote back. He says, "I greatly enjoyed it." And he says, "What it has done for me is give me an idea now of who my grandfather was and what he became." And I'm very grateful to have that. So that's the kind of a fellow he was. He was very helpful to me. The other person was a woman who was approaching 100 when I first discovered her. Her father had been a lawyer in Tudor's early days in Newfoundland, and as a consequence became a friend of their family and was back and forth. She just was aware of him all her life growing up, and at the end of his life, she was at middle age. He had no other people to look after him. He had no family. He had one caregiver, possibly a lover, we don't know for sure, but there was a woman who lived in with him for a long time. And she was a close friend of this 100-year-old lady I finally came across. So she had a lot of stuff. I mean, she was a woman who actually was talking about someone that was very familiar to her. And on the one hand, she was very careful about what she had to say about him. On the other hand, she could be engaged in long conversations about the guy. And from her, I extracted an awful lot of the human dimension of him that I'm able to report in the book.
Does that include, drawing out his experiences in the fishing industry, that like his supposed reason for coming to Newfoundland?
Yes. Well, the fishing industry was a cover story from the get-go. He was going to go over there and he was going to live in a little commune with a bunch of former military officers and Brits who were in retirement over there in very, very remote part of Newfoundland. And he was going to spend his time with them, as I understand it. He needed a cover story, though, and a source of some income. So they basically set him up in one of those jobs that you didn't really have to show up for. He knew nothing about fish marketing, salt fish marketing in Europe, but they put him together with a couple of businessmen who would handle all that, and he would be a sort of a consultant or whatever. And it's an amazing coincidence. Just around the time he was going to start his idyllic life with the other military people, these two guys, within weeks of each other, died. And so suddenly this cover story job was a real job. So for about 7 or 8 years, he actually had to fill a role as a guy buying and selling, processing salt fish, and traveling around Newfoundland, making deals with fishermen and merchants, and getting to know the business, which he did. And he did it for as long as he had to, and then he got out of it. But that was sort of a turn in his life that he had never really expected to make, I believe, and he got out of it as fast as he could.
It does seem to echo what happened to him, like in Ireland and in Palestine, that like he maybe goes in for one thing and then comes out the other side with a vastly different experience, right? Like that he's a soldier and he ends up being a policeman. He's a warrior and he ends up trying to be a peacekeeper. That these things happen to him where he kind of backs backwards into these.
And he became a peacemaker using the techniques of the so-called terrorists that he was trying to make peace with. So he figured, if I can't beat them, or the only way I will be able to beat them is to fight fire with fire. So his police force under his command embraced an awful lot of the ugly practices of say the IRA, sort of murder and mayhem, and his police force were better armed. There were more of them, and so they did a far more horrific job of it than the Irish rebels did. And at the end of about a year and a half, the Irish rebels were forced to basically say, okay, like, how are we going to work this out before we're all dead? And that's what he did. But he adapted to changes in his circumstances. He adapted to the role he played in Ireland with a very cold and considerate. He was pretty ruthless in his own personal life. He basically told his wife and kids, I can't be with you anymore. I'm wherever I am, there will be danger, so I'm going someplace that you can't come. And he went to a place like Newfoundland. Now, in those days, to go to Newfoundland was like going to the moon. Once you got there, you didn't. I mean, he did make it a point to go back and forth to England whenever he could for brief and highly secret missions. But by and large, once he went to Newfoundland, that's where he was going to spend his life. And then he gets to Newfoundland, and the whole concept that he had for survival in Newfoundland goes out the window. He had a piece of land all purchased. He was ready to build a little place alongside the other British military people on the west side of Newfoundland. And he couldn't do that. He had to sell that property and end up living in St. John's for pretty well all of his life. His health started to fail in his, I guess, 60s. And then he found a partner who was a nurse, and a decent, lovely lady who of Irish extraction who moved in with him and looked after him for the rest of his life. So, and he had this little circle of influential friends, lawyers and politicians and former members of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment that sort of stayed loyal to him over his time in Newfoundland. And he didn't have a perfect life there, but he had a safe life there. And it was relatively respectable until pretty well everybody that knew him had died off, and he was a fairly isolated individual. And then over time after that, all the stories about him basically dried up. But I had the good fortune to find a couple of living parts of his life who actually could bring some of those stories back to the conversation.
The Newfoundland portion being The Exile in the subtitle, A Soldier's Tale of War, Deceit and Exile. The book is An Accidental Villain out through Random House. Linden MacIntyre, thank you very much for joining me on the program. Congratulations.
It's great to talk to you, and thanks for the interest. After all this time I've spent, I now love talking about it. Now that I know something, I have something to say. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.